discussion groups or political discussions, group discussions, and we were trying to win over more people to the strike at that period of time. And this was after, obviously, the major police occupation of the campus, which occurred on April 30th. And as throughout the rest of the semester, there was a strike that shut down the entire university for the rest of the year.
So Gus Reichbach, now a judge, then a leader of SDS. Please set the scene for us. How did this happen? Where were you before the strike?
Well, I was one of the few law students who was involved in campus activity, anti-war activity, anti-gym activity. The actual event itself was a spontaneous one in terms of the actual occupation of the buildings. But the predicate for it was really years of organizing on the campus, really beginning in 1964. The year before, there had been a big demonstration about recruitment and ROTC. The gym was becoming an escalating issue. People were getting more and more responsive to the protests of the local community in Harlem who was opposing the gym. So, you know, we're often given, I'm happy to say, more credit than we deserve in the sense that this was seen as a well-calculated plot, where at any point along that day, things might have taken a different turn. In fact, probably if Dean Coleman in Hamilton Hall had opened his door and received a petition, the occupation may never have occurred. So things proceed in peculiar ways, but even though the events were unplanned, the lead-up involves years of organizing.
You mentioned 64, Bill Sales, 65, Malcolm X was gunned down not far from there. Now, actually, at the Audubon Ballroom, that's been taken over by a new building, the Columbia University Biotech building, also very controversial. Did that play a role, though that was 3 years before?
The Students Afro-American Society has very definite links to Malcolm X through the son of Kenneth Clark, Hilton Clark, who was one of the founding members of that organization, was very much inspired by Malcolm X. SAAS always had a distinctly black nationalist aura about it. That was basically its guiding principle. So we saw ourselves as being in a tradition that had been highlighted by Malcolm X. When we actually took over Hamilton Hall, we renamed it Nat Turner Hall of Malcolm X University.
Explain who Nat Turner was.
Nat Turner was a slave preacher who in 1831 in Southampton County, Virginia, led the largest slave revolt on the North American mainland.
Bill, one of the things I think that most people are not aware of, because sometimes they don't connect all of the events that leading up to a particular crisis, was the climate. As I've often mentioned, this strike or the occupation began less than 3 weeks after the King assassination, and the impact on young people then, not only of the assassination, but of the disturbances and rebellions that broke out in over 100 cities across the country. I don't know if any of you want to talk about what the climate for young people was at that moment, at that particular moment in history.
Well, I certainly can speak to the African-American experience, and it's certainly what made it an important experience was that for the first time that others than African Americans were also being caught up in that energy. But most of the people in Hamilton Hall had been in one or another urban rebellion. For instance, you mentioned the King assassination. That very night, I and Ray Brown and other people would go on to play leadership roles in the takeovers on 125th Street. First time anybody ever shot at me, it was a policeman shooting over my head on 125th Street as various stores went up in flames. We were also much earlier that previous summer in Newark, during the Newark rebellions. We had raised funds in support of the families of students killed on February the 8th, I think, at Orangeburg, South Carolina, South Carolina State. So there was a continuous involvement in the turmoils of the day that incorporated larger and larger numbers of people who ultimately would take over those buildings.
And Tom, also the impact of the Vietnam War, obviously, on the students, not only Columbia but other universities. Again, it was a particular moment in history. The Tet Offensive had just occurred earlier in the year. Lyndon Johnson had announced his resignation. The Eugene McCarthy campaign was building up. What was, again, the impact of the war on all of us, but the other young people at the time?
Well, there was a New York Times op-ed piece this week by somebody who was there in Columbia, which said essentially that the war had nothing to do with the demonstrations. He also said, in defense of his behavior, that he was crazy. He said it 11 times in the article. He said that the war made him crazy. I think that there's some truth in that people were driven to extremes, felt devastated, particularly by the murder of Dr. King. I'd been a community organizer in Newark in '67. We went through and watched the killings of 25, 26 people. The war was ever present, and it's a big difference from Iraq because you could be drafted, and many of the young people in the community or on the campus could not vote. I wouldn't call the response crazy. The logic of it was like in the 1930s, industrial workers occupied factories in Michigan because they didn't have union representation, they didn't have any protection, they didn't have living wages. In my experience in the South in the early 1960s, black students and some whites, sat in at lunch counters and went to jail and refused bail, because powerless people sometimes have to do that in order to get any leverage or get any attention. And so the occupation of buildings by students who had no rights, trying to fight for people in Harlem who had no representation on the campus. The campus was run autocratically under an 18th century regulation that gave the president all power, no due process. If you're going to get kicked out, like yourself, there was no recourse, there was no appellate process. That was the situation.
Tom, can you explain the founding of SDS, Students for a Democratic Society?
I wish I could. SDS was a kind of a clearinghouse for discussion. It was in response to two things. One, the imperative to do something in support of the Southern students who were sitting in at lunch counters and going to jail. And secondly, there was a rising awareness of the fact that students themselves, everywhere in the country, had no rights, no real power on campus, were treated like children. So SDS was about student power. But it was power to make a difference on campus and in the community and in support or solidarity with other movements.
And it was founded
and it was founded slowly in a 2-year period, and most people would date it as '61, and then the Port Huron Statement, which is named after a town that's called Port Huron. In a recent Michael Moore movie, actually, you can see what Port Huron looks like. The Port Huron Statement called for participatory democracy, an end to the Cold War, the nuclear arms race, and a focus on the internal problems of the United States, starting with race, poverty, and civil liberties. And so it became associated with all the movements that were starting spontaneously. I don't think it was necessary to those movements, but it became a kind of channel where people could form chapters, discuss the situation, come together. It had a short life. It was a catalytic organization, I would say, a life of 6 or 8 years.
Well, interestingly, I mean, I think it was the importance about the Columbia strike was that it brought together a variety of movements that had been developing not only against the Vietnam War and racism on campus, but the gymnasium was sort of it brought the whole battle beyond beyond the university itself. Because I remember I actually was not a member of SDS at the time. I was actually more involved in some of the liberal student tutorial programs that were in West Harlem and in East Harlem. And I got involved actually in January because there was a protest at the gym site. Columbia University was building a university gymnasium, but it was taking public park land, and it was going to create a backdoor entrance for the Harlem community to use from time to time when the university saw fit to give it some time. And there'd been no real discussion about this in Harlem. It was a deal that the university did with the city. So the community group that I was working with was participating in a protest at the gym site in January, 4 months before the strike. So I went because it was our community group that was involved, and all of a sudden, this young African-American minister, whose name I don't know, I'd never met him before, came up to me and 3 other Columbia students who were standing around. Mark Nason, who was a part of Columbia Corps, and a guy by the name of Will Stein. They were both organizers of Columbia Corps. And the young